Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Thursday, so it's Jordan Peterson Thursday. We are on Rule 12, which is almost the end of the 12 rules, but we still have not gotten to the coda, which is my final chapter, which we are going to do next. So with that, let me hand it over to Roger and Claire.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us. Today, we're going to be covering Rule 12, which is the final rule in the book. But as Shrikant mentioned, there is also a coda, which essentially brings all the rules together and kind of gives a good summary of all of his ideas. And for this rule, the rule is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. This rule is going to be Jordan Peterson's view on the question of justification of existence, what the alternatives bring, and how he found his justification through his challenges that he believes others can also use. It's very much on the Jungian sense of if you're able to solve a problem well enough in the micro level, it can expand to a macro solution. And the first section, which is the one that made me laugh the most, is you have the rule, and then right under it says, dogs are okay too. And Peterson immediately jumps in to explain that, okay, I know the rule says pet a cat, but dogs are fine too. It just happens to be that cats work out better. Claire, what did you think of this first section about the clarification of dogs?
I love this chapter. And this is one of the chapters to turn to when things are at their darkest. This is kind of the terminal illness chapter. This is the chapter when you are in your darkest depth of hell to go to, and yet that's sort of juxtaposed with this image of a cat. And so he wants to kind of lay out this heavy lesson, I think, in a way that's really approachable with the pets with which we live our lives. But he acknowledges up front that, it's a two-sided battle when it comes to dogs and cats. And he doesn't want to kind of drive away any of the pro-cat lovers. He's choosing cats for a specific reason, but he likes dogs too. Kind of random, but I think funny and humorous, and especially for such a kind of heavy topic. So dogs are okay too.
Yeah, and he really, in most of this chapter, he's going to be using a lot more personal anecdotes, which I think is really important. And out of all the chapters we've covered, I would say this one's the one I've struggled most with, and that I tried to prepare as much as I could, but it's actually quite hard, mostly because this whole chapter, a lot of it is him telling his own personal story about suffering and about going through hell, or his own version of hell. And, a quick summary of bullet points or, key takeaways doesn't quite do it justice. So if you do have a chance, I really do recommend you read this chapter. But we will try to kind of go through some of the main points that he gets, and kind of some of his own life story that kind of really shows all the struggles he had to go through. And he starts, go ahead.
Roger, because there is no panelist, I'm going to jump in periodically.
Perfect.
So Roger, why do you find this particular chapter to be hard?
Well, first and foremost, he really takes on, personally for me, it was one of the few times I've ever heard an argument to get out of nihilism that I found somewhat convincing. And additionally, just in trying to present it, like I mentioned before, this is a much more personal chapter. He's kind of walking you through his daughter's struggle with arthritis when she's a little girl, and it's really painful, and a lot of the small key details are what make the chapter so impactful, but they're also hard outside of just reading the actual full chapter. They're hard to kind of summarize and make it into a key takeaway. So out of all the chapters, I would definitely recommend that this one's the one that you would want to read more for its personal effect, but it's also what makes it most convincing of all of them.
Thank you.
And so to start, he kind of points out that Michaela, his daughter, also has a hypoallergenic dog, and that normally she grew up with a bunch of different pets because that were kind of weird, like lizards, iguanas, and all these other stuff, because she was normally very allergic to your typical pets. And he kind of just drops that in as a you know, as foreshadowing for these issues to come, goes into some general psychology about in-group versus out-group and the ideas of cooperation versus competition, using the dog people versus cat people as a general template to demonstrate that he says that it's we always thrive to climb into a hierarchy. So we always want to be cooperative. We want to join a group. However, once we've joined that group, we identify with that group, which then means anything outside that group becomes competition. So he points out that it's the problem of optimization, of wanting and needing people around us, but then also once we've belonged to a group, wanting that group to succeed among others. And that's why you have this dynamic of once you're in any arbitrary in-group, naturally the out-group becomes the competition. So, and I really do like that he kind of says like, look, I don't want to upset dog people, even though it's a completely arbitrary and useless category, but many people will. And he says, and some cat people might now feel slighted because they got excited about reading about cats and now you're reading about dogs. And then once he kind of gets you chuckling about that, he becomes the more serious existential Peterson, moving on to the next section, which is naturally called Suffering and the Limitations of Being. And here he kind of starts with what he's kind of been pushing this entire book, that is the true tenet of life is suffering, and the idea that all religions seem to identify this, all mainstream religions seem to identify this. He says the Buddhists state this directly. It is, you know, one of the four truths. Christians tend to state this with the cross. It is like the ultimate symbol of their savior, is the savior quite literally dying on a cross in a very brutal way. He also points out to the Jews tend to commemorate the suffering endured over centuries. And he kind of reflects on why that is, why we as humans seem to organize ourselves in such a way that points to life being a massive struggle between us. And he says that it's partially because of our limitations. We can be damaged, we're easily broken, we can be torn down emotionally and physically. And that's something that naturally is going to have to push us to a realization of life being intrinsically suffering, that there's no way to avoid it. And even if you can find a point in your life where that's not the case, you will always eventually hit that point. It's an unavoidable aspect of life, right? Claire, did you? Because
we'll eventually hit aging and loss, right? So even the most privileged life will deteriorate eventually at some capacity. And so he's starting to lay out this kind of classic nihilist struggle that life is suffering. It's an age-old story as far as religion goes, and it's going to happen to all of us. And so then what? How, despite that, can we survive and be happy? And he's going to go into then several examples. And he'll bring these examples through the chapter. Again, these are really deeply personal stories. These are the type of stories that just make you kind of as you're reading them. So go back on them. But the first is a client whose husband is battling cancer. And 5 years battling cancer, and what that sort of exhaustive, consistent struggle is like, and then also being faced with morality so consistently. The second is his son Julian. It's really cute. He says he was just a really, really cute kid. Like there's kids, but there was something so precious and sincere and pure about his son, Julian, especially when he was young, that he remembers so consciously thinking, this thing is so vulnerable. Like, how is it possible that this vulnerable creature exists in the universe and is so cute? And how can I kind of protect it from that? And then he's going to go into the third story of his daughter, and this is really the brunt of what's going to take us through the chapter. And he'll take us step by step. So, you know, we start to hear those early stories. We hear about the allergy. You know, he tells a story of kind of lifting up his baby toddler, putting her down on the ground and her kind of wincing, and him never doing that again, knowing something was weird, but a really, really happy child. And he tells a story of going to the beach and kind of overhearing this babbling child, and he can't hear what he's saying, and he leans in and she's just saying, happy, 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 happy. And just the purity and the happiness that existed within this child until she got to about 6. At which stage, there's really nothing more to describe this as just sort of a depression, a fog. She stopped smiling. She started looking down. Things got slower. Her speech got slower, kind of pace got slower. And at this point, they start to arrive at an arthritis diagnosis. So they're kind of being pushed from doctor to doctor. And we start to see really early that Michaela has a ton of impacted joints. And, the types of offices that you're going into to have this prognosis and bringing a child into it is really just absolutely devastating. He tells a story about, a fateful day in their family was a day that they got to Tammy brought Michaela to the zoo and had to push the child in a wheelchair the whole time. And just, these heart-wrenching stories. And I think what in the world is more heart-wrenching and really puts you in the face of suffering than the illness of a child.
And
Roger and Claire, we have a surprise panelist. Joe, my friend Joe, he was planning to join, but we had not kind of confirmed, but he's ready. So
yeah,
Joe,
jump on in and whenever you're ready.
Sure, thanks. Actually, you can keep going from where you were, but I just will make one comment based on what was just said. And it was the ups and downs that really caught me in this particular chapter. Like, all of a sudden she's healthy, and she spent the entire summer watching her Tammy is watching her daughter run around, and that these joys and these ups and downs, and how to manage these ups and downs is basically how we manage our own personal well-being. And, our understanding of being in and of itself. So I'll just leave it there.
No, it's a good point. And for me, one of the most heartbreaking quotes is, because as Pearson notes, is like he would pick her up, and every now and then every time he'd put her down, she would be crying, and he kind of could see something was wrong. And then once she becomes 6, a lot more signs start to come out that there's something wrong. And one of the quotes that's shared that just hit me really hard is that he says, at one point she asked him, it's like, when you were playing little piggy with me when I was little, was it supposed to hurt? And then Pearson follows that up with things you learned too late, right? This idea of like a father playing with his daughter, thinking, it's fun, and the child not being able to communicate. And she had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. I can't even say that correctly, and she had 37 affected joints without any known cause. And what that meant was she was going to have early joint replacements pretty much through her life, starting when she was very, very young. And at this point, it's also when Peterson notes that if you want a true test of faith, there's nothing harder than unsufferable pain put on an innocent child, right? And he even brings out the brothers Karamazov from of Dostoevsky, where he kind of points out that's like, what kind of God would make a world like this? How can you even believe in a God that would allow this thing to happen? And he kind of points to that same sensation when he thinks about his younger son, and he says, it's like, he was so young and vulnerable. And then Peterson, being the person he is, starts to think, it's like, okay, well, how would I solve this? What would make everything okay? It's like, maybe I could make my son 20 feet tall. That way no one could hurt him. No one could beat him up, right? He would never be threatened by anybody. Maybe he was made of titanium and had replaceable parts, right? So no one could ever hurt my son. And then he asks the next question, which would be, but would that still be my son? Would that still be the thing that I love? Or would it be just something completely different? And what he points out is that what you truly love about that person or about anything is inseparable from their limitations. And it's perhaps because our limitations shape us into what we are, right? Everything that we are is also our inability to be something else. It's also a limitation in that sense. So keeping that in mind, because that's going to be something that then shapes it. As Michaela gets older, she starts to get cortisol injections all over her joints. wrists, shoulders, ankles, elbows, knees, hips, fingers, toes, tendons. So this poor girl's entire body has just started to fall apart, and it's barely when she's starting to get into her teen years. And then he kind of goes in quite brutal detail as to how they keep trying different treatments and different drugs and all the negative side effects that come that are sometimes even worse than the actual condition she was going through in the first place. And eventually, as Joseph alluded to, there's those ups and downs. She becomes the first child to be given a drug that was meant for adults, and it works. It miraculously takes off a lot of her pain, and for 4 years, she's a happy, preteen to teenager. And then again, goes right back down. Her elbow starts to hurt again, meaning that the illness hadn't subsided through puberty, which sometimes could happen.
There's a great little anecdote there as she's improving too about getting her to inject herself and about these limitations, that there's this little, and I mean, if you know Michaela, she's a tough girl, but you can imagine her as a child. And he says that he always knew she was very money conscious. She would like try to sell her books on the street. And so he started to incentivize her. If you inject yourself with this, I'll give you $10 or whatever the price was. And she sat for 30 minutes. It was tedious. It was awful. And then she, is stabbing herself. And what a painstaking thing to have to get to pay your child to do. And then it's like, okay, I'll give you $10 if you do it in 5 minutes, and increase. But I think what a brilliant Peterson telling the story, that he was starting to reward the strength and the resiliency and the riding up against the limitations.
One of the things I'm sorry, were you done, Claire? Okay. So, I mean, one of the things that, you just mentioned, Roger, is the thing that I actually was the major takeaway for this chapter, right? So how do you keep going? And then how do you guard against your own personal nihilism? And, this idea where you love the person, not despite their limitations, but because of their limitations. And that's a very specific quote in the chapter that had jumped off, and I was just listening to it, and that had caught my ear. And because being requires limitations. And so therefore, this is a critical point, because I feel like this is often lost in our society today, is that we often judge limitations as something that being, and it's our inability to be vulnerable with other people. And we have this idea that everything is okay, but our limitations are the reasons we actually can be loved. And I think he really highlights that very nicely in this chapter, that this is the way forward, and it's a way of guarding against, that all the nihilistic thoughts that are going to come along inevitably when you have this. You can go one of two ways. You can go the way of the Columbine shooter, or, you can go the way of, of somebody that's going to persevere. And I think that that's the beauty of this chapter.
Absolutely. There's a great, I think it's a Hebrew quote that he says, that imagine a being that is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. What would they lack? And so, I mean, if you can think about an ideal of yourself, it's that. And the answer is limitation. And so I think it paints this picture. And I think, Roger, you've used this example before of like, what's so good about heaven if there's no limitation? Like if you have everything, if everything is always good, that's not being, to your point, Joe. So well said.
Oh yeah. And there's also, because that's the very next section. I do want to really quick, just to give context, because at the same time, Michaela also finds out that she's going to need a hip replacement surgery when she's 30. And then one day she finds out it has to happen in her teens instead, because her femur actually appears to be dead. And then from that brings us to the next section, which is exactly what you guys are talking about. It's the ideas of God and its limitations. And as Claire said, that Hebrew story of imagine a being who is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. What does such a being lack? And the answer is limitation, because without limit, everything is therefore everything. Like if you can be everything, if you're everywhere, if you can do everything, all you're describing is everything, but you're not actually anything. There's no differentiation between you and everything else, because you are everything else. You can do everything else, and you can you can know everything else, right? So it's like the fact that there's a limitation, and as the story goes, that's why God created man, to create the story, to create a narrative, to create something out of nothing, right? And Peterson says that he tells this to the lady to a client whose husband has a terminal illness. And he points out, like, look, this isn't a solution to either her issue or mine. It's like, but there is a value in seeing that connection between the necessary connection between existence and limitation. And he uses the example of Superman, which I really love, because he points out that, like, look, you can see Superman, which Peterson sees a lot of superhero myths that we currently do as a regression from our religious beliefs. Essentially, like, since we killed our own God, we're trying to make new ones, and we're still experimenting with what that would look like. And he says, by 1938, you got your typical early, close to World War II Superman. He can move cars, fastest speeding bullet, leap over buildings on a single bound. And he says, like, but then they just keep giving him more powers. By 1960s, he can fly faster than light. He has super hearing, X-ray vision, laser eyes. You can nuke him, nothing happens to him. And Peterson, on several other chats, has also said, like, he essentially became God, right? And what we found out about making someone a god is they get very boring very, very quickly. And there's a quote that I really like where he says, it's like, okay, who's going to buy this magazine? It's like, God goes against an evil thing and God wins. God goes against something else, and then God wins again, and then God against something else, and God wins. Like, you already know the full story before you even read the story. So then they started to add some limitations. That's where suddenly kryptonite gets introduced, and there's all these different kinds. And then he says, but they still have this similar problem where, like, the whole myth kind of starts to crash on itself, because it's not very interesting to humans anymore. And what he says that by the 1980s, he's essentially a walking Deus Ex Machina. And a Deus Ex Machina is just basically a machine from the gods. It essentially is a term that's used to put in something that there's no reason to think it would ever be there. So he lists several good examples. So one is another superhero that's called Lifeguard, who can develop any superpower as long as it can save a life. And it's like, okay, well, then you can just do whatever you want. It's always going to end well for that guy. Like, that guy's never going to have any issues at all that he has to solve himself. He points to Stephen King's The Stand, where, the all hope is lost moments happened. No one can actually do anything. And then God just shows up and kills the evil character. You're like, all right, I guess I didn't know that was actually going to be a thing, but all right. Or the classic Dallas, I think he said the 9th season there's an entire season. At the very end, it turns out the entire season was just a dream, very conveniently. There's no actual consequences or meaning to any of that. That was just kind of for fun. And he points out that when these things happen, we feel cheated and lied to. And it's like the hero has to be something that has to contend with something else. And eventually he points out that the superheroes eventually revise. They take out a lot of the superpowers he used to have, and then put other limitations, like he's dependent on the sun and has to do, all these other things that actually restrict them. But in restricting Superman, they actually define an actual hero rather than just something that can do everything. And did you have anything, Claire?
Yeah, no, I think you went through the Superman example really well. I mean, the Achilles heel, like, there's so many examples of this, of the necessity of humanity in our heroes. And I think we all can, we can relate to that feeling of you get through 6 seasons of Lost and nothing is resolved, and maybe it never was, or wishing for more wishes, like, just that it just doesn't feel right, and that doesn't feel human, because we know our flaws and we can feel our mortality.
Well, and I also go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I hope I don't skip too far, but the idea of being requires becoming is something that he outlined in the chapter, where it was this static existence that we get bored, And, and I forget exactly how he put it, but it was something along the lines of, you're becoming at least something different to stay interesting. And that is the process that, how we can identify with these heroes, is that there's some form of humanity that we actually like about them, their vulnerabilities. And I think that that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think to your point, he basically said, what he's kind of says is like that they have, if the hero can do everything, then, and they have no limits, then they have nothing to strive for.
Right.
And if they have nothing to strive for, then they have nothing to work against. And if they have nothing to work against, then they're not admirable, right? Like if they can already do everything, it's like, all right, well then that's not that impressive. Like I always think of people that cheat in sports or in games, right? It's like, why don't we like that? It's like, well, because you've already did something to make it so that the challenge isn't the challenge anymore, right? So there's nothing impressive about that. And so then Peterson says, okay, look, so it seems like being requires limitations. So then now we have that problem. It's like, well, what about the suffering that comes from having those limitations? And this is where he humors these ideas that go counter to that perhaps existence itself is a lost project, where mistakes of nature, of evolution, maybe it would be better if there was nothing at all, or maybe it'd be better if we as people didn't exist. It's like, these are two reasonable and logical conclusions that you can draw from this. And he points out that the first conclusion, that maybe there should be nothing at all, normally will rationally bring you to suicide, right? If there should be nothing at all, why not just kill yourself then? And that's the antinatalist point of, just the suicidal point of view. And then he says the second one, the idea of perhaps there shouldn't be beings that are conscious. Maybe it's just us who are messed up. That's the antinatalist point of view, the idea that maybe we were better off never been born. And he says that brings you directly to genocide. That's the rationalization that you get from the shooters of Columbine, all these people that don't see the value in life and see that life might actually be the problem more than the solution. And he tries to take that question genuinely on. And this is for me, I do want to read a quote real quick, if you guys will allow me, that I think is a really good counterpoint to that. Because he says that perhaps these complaints of existence are understandable and reasonable and even logical for all the pain and suffering that life and existence cause and that make it occur. And then he says, hating life, despising life, even for the genuine pain that it inflicts, merely serves to make life itself worse, unbearably worse. There is no genuine protest in that. There's no goodness in that. Only the desire to produce suffering for the sake of suffering. That is the very essence of evil. And it's this idea that if you take that criticism of existence fully in, to do anything about that, you actually make the very thing you're complaining worse. You're worsening the very thing that you were criticizing, that you originally had an issue with, of existence. Right? If you say it was better if we shouldn't be alive, it's like, all right, why? Because there's too much suffering and hurting and loss and pain. It's like, okay, well, what's the solution? Like, we should get rid of everyone. It's like, well, wouldn't that just cause more pain, suffering, and hurt? Like, isn't that the exact same thing that drove you to this conclusion in the first place? And so he then says, like, so maybe that's not a viable solution either. And then he asks the question, like, well, can being be truly justified? And here's where it gets kind of interesting, because he says, look, this question, you're not going to be able to get it through by thinking. Rationality and logical structures will not save you here. They'll collapse on themselves, because logic we use to organize the world in our reality and existence doesn't necessarily seem to function in that. And he says, thinking, for all its power and ability, is not able to answer these questions. It collapses on itself when life is shown to be existentially intolerable. And Peterson notes that it's not thinking that can get you out of there. It's noticing. And for me, I just thought of Marduk in the Mesopotamian god, which is held as the highest virtue, is not thinking, but attention. And Peterson notes that you may notice, for one, that the things that you love because of their limitation. This also includes life. Its limitation is what gives it its value. And there's several ways of thinking about this. One is supply and demand. If you live forever, life doesn't have any value to you at all. Another good quote that just popped out in my head was the film Troy, which is based on the writings of Homer, with the quote of Achilles basically talking to a believer of God that says, I'll tell you the secret. The gods envy us. Any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we're doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. And it's that limitation that is what gives it its value. Without that limitation, it doesn't hold any value. It's what makes everything so special about it. And then Peterson follows that by saying, but that's really easy to say, of course, when things are going well. But what about when things are not? What about when you're actually in the suffering? What about when you're actually in hell? How do you get through that? And that brings us to the next section. Any other things you guys want to put in before we move on?
No, I think you went through that really beautifully, and this point he's making at the end of that section is really important. You know, life is suffering. Why would we not just scrape the whole project? You know, we have some options. We have genocide. We have suicide. You know, we know that there's nothing fair. The history of the world is not reasonable, and we're going to get old and die. And that's all of that isn't good. The issue is that even acknowledging that isn't good, and you know, acting in belief of those truths only serves to make the situation worse. And it's this kind of like, is it a logical fallacy? I don't know what it's like. It's almost like you have to pretend, or you have to stand up or resist that in order to not make it worse. And what can you do to help fight that? Start noticing, start paying attention, start seeing the beauty in the little things. But as we said, it's way easier to stop and smell the roses when your child, you know, isn't having a hip replacement at the age of, young. So moving on to the next section, we're going to bring back Michaela, and her situation is really going to get far worse. As she moves into kind of puberty, she can't sleep. She's starting to be medicated heavily with codeine. That stops working. She is in terrible pain. And the one doctor doesn't feel comfortable prescribing her opiates. They have to go shop around to find other doctors, at which point they are then prescribing the small child a dose of opiates, which is, you know, temporarily relieving the pain, but, you know, having effects, and she's kind of dozing off and not herself, and, you know, a child impacted by really heavy level of benzos. They try other things. They try Ritalin to kind of go on the other perspective that alleviates the pain for a while, keeps her distracted, but comes with its own set of side effects. And so this situation is really catastrophic and is having huge impacts on the family.
Yeah, and at this point, she's had her hip replaced already, and then she also gets her ankle replaced. And originally, they just wanted to fuse the ankle. And Peterson notes that's normally what you do when you're 80, and it's like, look, it'll just get you around. But she's like, but at this point, I think she isn't even 20 yet, and it's kind of like we need to find some other solution here. So she does get her ankle replaced, but then while her foot's healing, it's been mispositioned, which to me hits a soft spot, because that's what happened when I broke my femur. So I can very much feel just how much pain that is, because it's insane amount of pain. And they can't prescribe her any more opiates because she's already built a tolerance, because most of her life she's been on this stuff. So Michaela, being the badass that she is, decides to tape herself off of them, and, you know, goes through withdrawal, which is also a beast. And here, through all this, Peterson notes that these were some of the most demanding times for not just him, but his entire family. And he doesn't try to claim that these things couldn't solve everything. He simply says, look, these are the things that I learned during these moments. And see, these are some strategies for how to deal whenever life gets as dark as it is going to get. And he says, one, set aside time to discuss the issue and how you're going to manage it every day. And then after that, do not talk or think about it otherwise. So the idea is you and whoever else is dealing with this, you're going to strategize. You're going to have a time when it's time to fully face the chaos, fully face this thing. Outside of that, you need to be able to rest. You need to be able to recover. Your brain needs to be able to be interested in other things and think about other things, because otherwise you will just burn yourself out worrying. And this is very hard for people for the worriers in the group, right? Like I'm one of them, where if you have a concern and anxiety, your brain just will not stop. And one thing that he points out that's really helpful to understand is that he says, your brain the part of your brain that creates anxiety is much more interested in the fact that you have a plan over what that plan actually is. Right? It just wants to know, hey, you're not ready for this. You haven't addressed this. You don't have a contingency plan for this. Once you have one, whether it's good or not, that anxiety aspect can be like, okay, well, we have something to work with here.
And this, I think, is such an impactful tool. It just jumped off the page when I first read it. Whenever you're going through something really harrowing, setting aside, we're not going to talk about it all day. We're going to talk about it at 6 p.m. every day. It preserves the relationship. I mean, often the relationships are what really get deteriorated in this. But I also find in self-talk, like when in times where I'm plagued by some issue, not letting myself wake up every morning and think about it all day at work, and just setting aside those times to really dive in and feel the feeling and allowing yourself to block out at the other time. So I think that's a really great practical tip to kind of like put in the back of your brain for when shit hits the fan. The second is to shift the unit of time you use to frame your life. This is so beautifully powerful. If you can't think through the rest of the year because your husband's dying of a terminal illness, you have him for this month. If you can't get through this month because your pain is so intolerable that you can't get out of bed, can you get through today? If you can't get through today, can we get through an hour? Can we get through 15 minutes? And then within whatever that frame of time that you think is reasonable, that you can muster to survive through, pay attention during that time. Really live it, really see it for what it is. And be careful and be cautious and look deeply at it.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, no, condensing that time is actually critical. And it maps back to something you said earlier, Claire, with the idea that not only are you condensing the amount of time, but you're focusing on the good things and the little things within that time frame. So you're also changing your thoughts. You're not thinking too far in advance, but you're also changing your perspective. And you're condensing the amount of time that you're actually thinking and living minute by minute. So,
and yeah, that's a great point. And for the last tool that he gives, which is going to be his main takeaway, is to maintain sight of the good in being. He points out that many people can survive many horrors and pain and suffering as long as they can still see the beauty in life, the point in life. But if that is lost, then you are truly lost, right? Then it's just, if you don't even have the justification for why you're going through it, then it just becomes hell, right? You're suffering just for the sake of suffering by your own interpretation of your own reality, which then brings us to the last section where he tries to lighten it up right before he drops an anvil in your head by saying that dogs are great and they make great allies. But cats, there's something slightly interesting about cats, is that they're not hierarchical. They're not very social. They quite literally are an embodiment of nature. They look at us and they judge. And, they judge us, but they judge us in a way that approves, right? They seem to like us, or at least sometimes. And Pearson,
sometimes that is so comical, because we all know that look from a cat where the cat's just like, okay, like you can pet me. It's that sort of haphazard approval that I think we all is so true of being, that it looks at the sins and the gross just grotesqueness of humanity, and it's like, okay, I'll roll on my stomach for a second and then I'll walk away. And that in a way is where it's really being manifest, and that's why he's pulling out the cat example.
Right, and the fact that it's a reward, right? It's something that's nice. Whenever you call a cat, you don't know if it's actually going to come over. You know, you don't know what it's going to do. So when it does and it lets you pet it, and Peterson points out that there's a cat lives across the street. I think that its name's Ginger. He points out that whenever that happens, it's a nice break. You know, it's a light in the darkness that allows him to have a respite from the day, that allows him to be able to truly see, that you have to be alert to the beauty in life when you're surrounded by suffering, that you need to be able to keep an eye out for the things that are truly shining in life. Anything else before we close out?
No, I think it's really beautiful. I'm just wondering, how do we want to close out? I mean, do we want to read the last page or that last paragraph?
Well, I have a quick summary. I just didn't want to...
It's so powerful. No, I'm excited.
Right, yeah. Well, because this is just kind of me trying to put Peterson's ideas all together, is the idea that when life tests your faith in it, you have to be alert to the beauty in life that surrounds you, that hidden kingdom of God, because the things you choose to pay attention to shape your reality. This isn't a distraction from the hardship, but rather a reminder of why the price is well-deserved. You seek out that glimmer of light in the moments when life is at its darkest, and perhaps you might navigate it successfully. Yet, even if unsuccessfully, you can aim to stop from making everyone's suffering worse. And if we all aimed at least not making the pain we all must suffer worse than it already is, maybe we can bear the required burden of existence. Perhaps if we could manage that, we could even manage the world to make the world a better place. It's what we could be doing. It's what we should be doing, because we got nothing better to do. So keep a lookout for the intrinsic beauty in life. Maybe it can serve as a reminder for 15 seconds of the wonder of being that just may be worth the unavoidable suffering it requires. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street.
Wow. Wow. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Joe. Folks, now it's time for questions. 4 rules. Type exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom when you want to ask a question or make a comment. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anything, but do so courteously. It's going to be Dave, followed by Aaron next. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant, and Roger and Claire, great job. Mentioning Superman always makes me remember Christopher Reeve, the actor who played the part. And it was, especially, my favorite was the first movie. Handsome guy, athletic, but fell off a horse, broke his neck, and was permanently, a quadriplegic from then on. Took 2 years to learn how to breathe to get out of the iron lung. And when people talk about strength, they say, well, when did he have more strength? I think he had more strength afterwards. And I admire him much more. So I don't know if you want to talk about it now, but to me, it's an amazing story.
No, I mean, the only thing I'll add to that really quickly is that's the part of being vulnerable, right? And he's human, and it's how we identify with him. We identify with his heroic ability to handle that obstacle, not as Superman anymore. And I think that that's a really interesting point, because he's talking about our limitations as human beings as being why we can identify with each other and we like each other. And that's the beauty that we need to see.
Next up is Aaron. Aaron, go ahead.
Wonderful presentation, Roger, Claire, and Joe. One thing I would maybe add to this is this idea of when bad things happen to us, the very first thing that enters our mind is, I don't deserve this. Like, not me. I don't deserve this. It should be happening to someone else. I'm a good person, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, we automatically, like, I like to now think kind of the story of Job from the Bible, where all this, like, god-awful stuff happened to him, but his faith in God prevailed. But I think something even simpler that you can do is if you say to yourself, I'm a human being, and therefore we all suffer, therefore I deserve to suffering. Like, you're still going to suffer, but it takes the suffering from having ownership over you. Whereas the more you push the suffering away and say, I don't deserve it, the more it hurts. But once you say, okay, I deserve to be standing out here in the freezing rain, it's a part of life, I'm human, these bad things happen, it takes its ability to kind of like destroy your soul, so to speak.
Right. And yeah, just to add to that, I do like that idea of just, even if you're completely pessimistic about all this stuff, it's like, which one is the more practical, better view, right? To blame everything exterior to you, which you also have no control over, or to see what aspect of that was your fault, which you may actually be able to do something about, right?
Muted.
Shrikant, you're muted.
Thanks. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type ! or raise your hand in Zoom. Joe brought up the question of being and becoming. I think that is a huge point, because most people formulate their ideals in terms of being, and becoming, that we are fundamentally becoming creatures. You know, we live. So living is what we do, and that's what we are. That really changes the perspective. I think the being and becoming is a huge issue in philosophy, and that kind of underlines it. Any thoughts?
You know, I mean, the idea, and this speaks to what Aaron had just said, the idea of suffering because of our limits, when we start to look at it from that perspective, you know, what that really means, it prevents us from becoming. And I think that that's something that is throughout this chapter that I really is the key takeaway for me personally, because some of my own personal struggles that have, you know, I've had to, you know, a solution, or the only solution that I had is to either, you know, just one is keep going little by little, and to look at the little things and appreciate the little things, and to not blame other people for for anything that I was going through. And I think that's a theme throughout the entire book. You know, even if you come back to the rule 6, where have your own house in order before you go criticizing other people, I think that it directly correlates to what that means. It prevents you. It not only will it prevent you from becoming, in that case, you'll probably, you know, end up hating being itself. So I think that's, you know, that was a critical point, and it really speaks to Aaron's question.
Joe, oh, go ahead, Claire.
Sorry, Aaron. One element of becoming, though, is sacrifice, right? That you're becoming away from something, and the kind of courage that it takes to be walking toward knowing that you might be losing what's comfortable or behind us, I think is an important, and that's sometimes the part that makes becoming not so fun.
I just wanted to say one thing to add on to what Joe was saying. I think like one of the most primal forms of suffering that we have is pregnancy, for example. And I'm a guy, so I'll never know what it's like to be pregnant. But if we think of pregnancy, though, it actually gives birth to something new. You're giving birth to a new child. And I think that all suffering gives birth to your new self. So when you suffer, you give birth to a stronger, better, more wiser self. And I think that, you know, if you think of pregnancy, like it's almost like like so much suffering, so much pain, but then at the end of it, it's all worth it because now you've given birth to a new life.
I just want to comment on one thing. Pregnancy is not painful in most animals. It is painful in case of human beings because evolution is trying to maximize the size of the brain. And it is basically the tussle between a woman's ability to walk and the size of the head. And the optimization is the pain. It's the pain that makes possible the large brain creatures that can walk. So it is that pain which is responsible for our glory. Okay, next up is going to be Stefan. Stefan followed by David. Stefan, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I think something missing from the conversation about becoming, and perhaps this is more of a simple message that I got out of the chapter, is the ability to step out of one's comfort zone. I think that's what petting the cat represents. You'll never know like what joy that and harmony that might bring. And he gives some examples of your cup of coffee, dancing on the street, whatever that happens to be. And so that's just my comment. Claire, you mentioned something about looking back on the past, and what about the future? And if you're not able to be really one with yourself without stepping out of your comfort zone or doing something that you might not do in another situation.
Yeah, and I think shrinking the time zone helps you kind of predict for that future, right? So sometimes a 5-year plan is appropriate, sometimes a 30-year plan is appropriate, and sometimes it's only going to be a year. And so whatever that time zone is, aiming appropriately within it and aiming as high as you can and planning for the future. But, it's not everyone can kind of do it full swing.
Next up is David from Toronto.
Yeah, my comment is I dislike the idea of trying to make suffering somehow less by saying, well, you sort of gain through something or other. Some suffering is not good in any sense, in my opinion, but I still think it's valuable. What Jordan Peterson is suggesting is that even if there's no benefit to suffering, terminal illness, what's the benefit going to be there? You're going to die, and your loved ones are suffering while you're going through it. The beauty of what Jordan is suggesting here is that regardless of whether suffering has any benefit at all, and in fact, the worst case of suffering is where there is no benefit, it's just a terminal situation, and then that's it, is the idea of shortening the time frame and just each moment looking for what it is that can give your life a little, some benefit, some beauty that is there. It's amazing. I remember reading a description of a battlefield, and the next day after a huge battle, this is in the old days, medieval times. So, you got basically a field full of bodies, and then you have this beautiful sunrise and some soldiers sitting there and just, he's despairing over the battle. His friends have been killed. And then he sees this sunrise. And somehow, he just sees beauty where he thinks otherwise it's just hell. So I think Jordan Peterson's ideas here, this chapter to me is my most favorite chapter of his book. I like, some of the other rules I disagree with, some I agree with. I think maybe yes, maybe no. This chapter, I think, really hits the nail on the head. Thank you.
No, yeah, and I would definitely agree with you, David, on that. I think for my perspective, Peterson's main point is that petting the cat isn't what solves your problem. Petting the cat is a reminder of the beauty of life that's intrinsic to it. It's a reminder of the entire thing, the entirety of existence, and the fact that no, it's not just hell. It is hell. It contains hell. It also contains paradise, and it's always both. And maybe the paradise is worth the hell you have to go through to get it, right? And that's how I interpret it.
And it's cyclical, you know, like I think it's a beautiful story with the sunrise, but you know, with every sunrise there will be some further battle and some future challenge. And he wraps up the chapter really kind of with a foreshadowing, and he's talking about Michaela she's improving, you know, the calf muscle on her damaged leg is growing back. She has much more flexion in her joint. This year she got married and she had a baby girl, Elizabeth, named after my wife's departed mother. Things are good for now. And he finishes this book. It goes viral. He gets very famous. He goes on a speaking tour and goes into really a year of, and then his wife, Jordan Peterson's wife, gets ill, and he goes into a year of really psychological torment, which brings us to the future. And so I think just looking at his own life in parallel to what this book kind of ended is so moving and sort of jarring that no matter how strong the tools that you have, you know, there's going to be cat moments, and it's going to get hard, but being able to see that beauty is everything.
I want to add one thing. I mean, I think the Indian perspective, the Indian kind of meditation perspective, is to kind of maintain equanimity in the light of it. To kind of see suffering as just being kind of some wave that almost passes over you. Whereas the kind of this idea of kind of your love of being itself, or love of existence itself, is something that kind of remains as a constant thing through which these waves pass. The other idea that I found is actually I got through these books on stress. It's not the stress itself that hurts people, or I don't think it's the suffering. Suffering is bad. Stress is bad. But it's the stress about stress, or kind of suffering about fear of suffering, you know, things like that. It's like a reaction and trying to avoid something which is kind of natural part of life, which makes it even harder, I think. Let's see. David, you had another point?
To your point, I really don't like discounting suffering. I mean, this trying to somehow justify it, to say, oh, you're physically suffering, but somehow mentally you can overcome it.
No, David, I don't think it is discounting. What it is that it is trying to put it in perspective. Right. Like negative emotions are kind of your feedback about something wrong that is going on. That is part of our biology. So for example, if you just look at it at a biological term, negative emotion is basically telling you something is wrong and you need to do something about it. And like, for example, stress is like that. When you try to get stressed about stress, you're trying to actually avoid it. Just accepting it, considering this, to give you the most extreme example of this, I'm going a little bit off topic here, but they did a study. It was, you know, a longitudinal study of many people, and they asked people following questions. Are you stressed? Second, do you consider stress to be bad, or do you consider it to be natural? And they tabulated the results of it and found out kind of the longevity of people based on that. And what they found, rightly, people who are stressed and don't think that stress is unnatural, they had the shortest life. And people who are not stressed were better off. But the interesting thing is people who are stressed and consider stress to be natural actually lived longer than people who are not stressed. So I think it's kind of, you know, when you're trying to avoid suffering, which is natural, you're kind of get pushing at life in the wrong direction, which doesn't really work with biology, doesn't really work with psychology. So it's not about discounting suffering. It is kind of putting it in perspective, seeing that it is part of life, that the cat is still there, that, you know, So I don't know whether that this one, but let's move on because we will. What we will do is Aaron. So let's take a quick comment by Aaron, and then we will go to breakout rooms, and then we'll be able to discuss all of this, and then we can come back and talk about our takeaways in detail.
Yeah,
Aaron.
Shrikant. Yeah, Shrikant, I really like what you said, and just a story that happened to me 2 hours ago. I was sitting in CVS waiting for a prescription, and they said 15 minutes, but it ended up being an hour. I was sitting there reading my Kindle. It was kind of unpleasant, but there was this one lady that was going absolutely crazy next to me and being like, I can't believe it, blah, blah, blah. Why is it taking so long? And I think that's like the perfect example of like not deserving the suffering and fighting the suffering. Whereas I was suffering too. It was pretty boring just sitting there for an hour. But I was like, okay, it's part of life. I'm accepting this suffering as a part of my life. And I think the experience was that much more pleasurable than when you actively fight against the suffering.
Yeah. It's kind of like doing jiu-jitsu on suffering.
That's right. Yeah, it's exactly.
Right? Pushing back doesn't really work very well. You kind of have to work with it. All right. So folks, I'm going to start the breakout rooms.